So can you tell me a little bit more detail about the process of pricing?
Sure, absolutely. So you can break down the pricing process into two. One is the secondary market research itself, and the second is primary market research. And one sort of leads to another. And when you think about the secondary market research, it's what it sounds. You are behind a computer and you are going through different academic papers, but also analyst articles, and you are trying to understand two or three different things. One is the patient segment that your drug is going to target. What is the characteristic of that patient segment, and what is the size of that patient segment? So that's very important. The second is you're trying to understand again the market trend. What has been the market trend of drugs in these disease areas? The indication, are there any barriers as far as the prices are concerned? What are the typical prices? And that leads to the third aspect of this, which is looking at again the competitors. Very, very important. If you're not the first to market, then you have to always benchmark your price against your competitors. So you have to think about what are some of the evidence that the competitor has, and how does your evidence, the evidence of your drug, compare against your competitor. So you have to think about the clinical aspect of it, you have to think about the economic aspect of it, and the humanistic aspect. So those are sort of the three dimensions in which you compare your drug against your competitor.
So can you talk a little bit more about the competitors? If you have a competitor or another drug to compare against, that becomes your baseline, right?
Yeah.
But in some cases, you don't have another drug for the same condition.
Yeah.
So in that case, what is your comparator for price?
That's a very good question. And there's always a competitor. There's always a procedure or a drug or a device against which you have to benchmark your drug. And I think Gilead, when they came out with their drug Sovaldi, they encountered the same problem. And in their case, they compared it against liver transplant, the procedure. And they compared it against the cost impact of that, but also the long-term efficacy of this drug against that procedure. So in other words, if you're first to market, you are going to disrupt the market, but you can always benchmark it against something else.
So it's not necessarily a drug, but it could be a procedure, a surgical procedure, or whatever is being done
Absolutely.
Instead of to treat that condition.
Absolutely.
At that point.
You compare against the standard of care, and there's always a standard of care.
Great. And then once you have your secondary research, what is the next step?
Yeah, absolutely. So then you have to think about, the second step is to think about the stakeholders. When you bring the drug again to the market, you have to think about how you're incentivizing the stakeholders, how they're going to perceive that, what are the barriers there. And so you have to test your findings from the secondary research. You have to vet it against these stakeholders. Are you on the right path?
So can you talk a little bit more about who these stakeholders are?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about the stakeholders, there are always sort of two segments of stakeholders you have to think about. One is the primary set, if you will, which is the payers, patients, and physicians or providers. The second sort of the secondary set is the employers, and now recently the HTA, the Health Technology Assessment Agencies. You have to always think about them as well. So sort of those two segments are important when you think about pricing.
It's interesting to know that they're also an important stakeholder.
Yep.
And then once you identify these stakeholders, what sort of primary market research do you do, and what information do you gain from this process?
Yep. So again, you think about three things that you do with these stakeholders. The first is, like I said, you vet your assumptions, you vet your hypotheses that you have developed with your secondary research with these stakeholders. And by that I mean you have, by this time, you have a good understanding of how will you differentiate your product against a competitor, and you process that with, you socialize that with the stakeholders as well. From an evidence generation perspective, but also again from the barrier perspective, if they have any unmet needs, how can you sort of position your drug against their own needs? So that's one thing. But the other is also when you think about the payers. The payers always look at the price of the drug against sort of their own budget impact. So you have to think about what will be the impact of this price on their budget, but also the coverage restrictions that will be associated with these drugs. In other words, what will be the formulary position of this drug? Will it be a preferable? What tier of this drug? Which tier will this be positioned in? And you can sort of do a pricing analysis to put you in a preferable tier. And that brings me to the third point that you do with these stakeholders is the price sensitivity analysis. And by that I mean you showcase or you demonstrate 2 or 3 different sort of brackets of your price, and you try to assess which bracket or which range of the price will improve adoption. Because remember, strategically you have to think about market access but also adoption. So with this pricing with price sensitivity, you think about access and adoption aspect of it too. So those are the 2 things.
And then what do you do with that information after your secondary and primary market research?
Yep, and that's where you start sort of quantifying some of this qualitative research that you've done, qualitative secondary, qualitative primary, and then you start doing quantitative work. And by quantitative work, I mean two things really. One is you develop sort of an economic impact of this drug. So that's one thing. The other is you have to do some forecasting model as well, and I'll touch upon both of those. The first is budget impact, and there you're trying to assess the impact that the price of a drug will have on the cost that your stakeholder is bearing. So in other words, the payer has a fixed budget every year, and their payers are sort of in a they are in a tough spot because patients we switch our plans every so often, so they are looking at very short-term 1-year impact of your model of your budget. So you have to demonstrate the impact of the price of the drug within that 1 year, sometimes 3 years, depending on the payers. But also you have to think about the hospitals, because in many cases these drugs are being bought by the hospitals. These are hospital-based drugs. So to think about the cost impact to those hospitals. In the US, we always talk about cost offsets. So to think about the cost offset of those drugs. But let's not forget the patients. It's the patients sometimes which bear the cost of the drug as well as a copay or co-insurance. So you have to think about that as well. So you do that quantitative analysis, and you demonstrate some of that impact to these stakeholders. And that then brings us to sort of the forecasting model, where you think about, again, the revenues. How will the price of this drug impact their revenues now and into the future until your patent expires and after that? And that's where you do sort of the forecasting model.
Great, that sounds very complex. How long does the process take from the start of the secondary market research to poof, here's a price?
Absolutely. There's no timeline. There's no specific timeline. Every drug is different. Every disease area is different. Every indication is different. But typically, my recommendation, and I've heard that from other advisors as well, is to start early as possible. I've worked on products where we start thinking about the pricing when the drugs are in phase 2. Sometimes early phase 2, sometimes early phase 3, but early thought process for this pricing, but early engagement with the stakeholders is very, very important. And then, of course, you have to price the drug before you launch. So it typically takes about 2 or 3 years